All right, I'd like to welcome to our discussion on the recent changes that went into effect for Washington State's real estate agency law, which is under RCW 18.86. I am One Realty's designated broker, Brian Gass, and I want to thank you for joining me. Now, on January 1st of this year, some major changes went into effect related to the real estate agency law here in Washington. In fact, it's the biggest change into the law in its 26-year history. Now, intended to increase transparency and consumer protections, there are four areas of the law that are affected: the creation of the brokerage services agreements, changes to dual agency, the expanded duties owed by brokers, and the real estate brokerage in Washington pamphlet was updated. The brokerage services agreements that were created, they're required. New definition of them were added to the RCW. Previously, the law only required an agreement with the seller. Listing agreements, elements of the BSAs to be legal were added to RCW 1886.20. They had to have a term for a buyer, a minimum is 60 days. It had to have the name of the broker, had to have the type of agency, whether it was exclusive or non-exclusive. They must have a checkbox, so you have to be able to let the client know which one they get to choose. You have to consent to the broker acting as a limited dual agent. If so, that consent must be initialed. Also, there must be a consent to the firm's designated and supervising brokers acting as limited dual agents when multiple brokers are in the same firm who represent different parties in the same transaction. That's a very common thing, but needs to be disclosed now. There will be terms of compensation. You need to, that's where you're going to list the terms of compensation. Also, whether the compensation is offered from a third party or other brokerage firm. If that compensation is shared between firms, how that broker is compensated, all has to be disclosed. So it's not required. It's not required if the buyer is only purchasing commercial real estate. Defined in the RCW there as property in Washington State. Essentially, that's not anything to do with residential, right? That's not one single family residential unit or one multifamily structure with 4 or fewer units, unimprovement land that could maximum permitted for development of units, real property improved with single family residential units as condos, townhomes, timeshares, things like that. Now, limited dual agency was changed. Nothing's really changed from this. Dual agency is essentially when you have one agent that represents two parties, both sides of a transaction. They replaced all references of dual agency in the RCW with limited dual agency. Like I said, it doesn't really change much. The biggest change is in the duties, where they will say, we'll go over that in a minute. Now, duties for agents serving multiple parties in a transaction was expanded to include a requirement that the represented party must give consent to the agent serving as a limited dual agent by initialing the BSA. We talked about that earlier. Acknowledgement from the represented party. We talked about that. That the dual agent might not advocate terms favorable to one principal to the detriment of the other principal. They must include language to recognize the transaction involves different agents working in the same firm. This is the things that we covered in the BSA, the elements for the brokerage services agreements. Law of Real Estate Agency pamphlet was updated to include all the additional duties, and the name was changed to the real estate brokerage in Washington. They did expand the duties owed by brokers. So duties owed by brokers to the principals that they represent largely didn't change. You have your loyalty, confidentiality, and you have your disclosure, plus seek expert advice over things that the agent is not an expert in. Make a good faith and continuous effort to find properties if you're a buyer, and find a buyer for a seller if you're a duties owed by brokers. They did expand them to all parties in the transaction. So previous duties were just owed to a specific party, right? Either your seller or your buyer. Now they're going to say that there's certain duties that are owed to all parties, right? That you got to disclose things that are, reasonable skill and care, deal honestly and in good faith, right? Everything you see here. Timely present all written offers, disclose all existing material facts, right? These are things that even if you represent your seller, if you know that your seller is hiding something and you know it as an agent, you have always been able to disclose this. Now they just kind of put it in writing. You do have to provide the pamphlet to everybody that the broker represents services to. We have to disclose in writing any conflicts, things like that. That biggest change for the limited dual agency for everybody here is in that
somebody
limited dual agent may not advocate.
Everything else that
terms
the duties are
favorable
going to be
to one principal
largely
going to be the same. Other this is going to be the big hang up for anybody that thinks they can do a dual agent deal
in the law.
because technically you're not going to be able to do anything that has to do with
pamphlet.
The pamphlet's going to require
inspections
to
real estate.
All that's going to have
brokerage in Washington. They wanted to make it
zero-sum kind of cleaner, more common language for people to understand. You do still have to give it to somebody if they're in commercial, but people should be able to get this all the time. I will say that, adding specific agreements for buyers is huge because although buyer agency has been around since the law was developed in 1996, there was no real specific agreement for buyers. So it's going to be big here. It's going to work out. It's going to take a while to get people used to it, but it doesn't, buyer agency wasn't clearly articulated in the beginning. Still to this day, some people don't know who represents who, especially in dual agent deals. How brokerages are compensated is another thing. But I do want to say that there are going to be some problems with these brokerage service agreements, especially for the requirements, because there is no standard form. Each brokerage can write their own agreement. These minimum requirements that I showed in the beginning, these are just minimums. They're still a little confusing, but there's things like, who is providing brokerage services? When is that? Like, is it open house providing services? No. Look out for tail provisions. Look out for, there is a minimum 60 days for the buyer for some reason. So this is just something that everybody's going to have to really just get used to and look out for on these. One of the things too is you want to make sure that you read these things fully, understand the difference between exclusive and non-exclusive. Finally, on education, our buyers need and our sellers need to kind of understand the difference, right, between exclusive and non-exclusive, the terms, tail provisions, and the civil liabilities that are going to be on the hook for buyers now if they go and sign 2 or 3 of these buyer services agreements with one agent. And then the buyer behavior is going to need to kind of change a little bit and understand that, you can't just run around, and if you're under one of these buyer agreements, you can't be going to open houses. You can't be making phone calls, calling around to listing agents, calling around to other agents and asking about what the heck's going on with these different deals, because you are represented by one person now that you've signed, and you do these other agents a disservice by using up their information, but you also are doing your agent a disservice by you bringing these other people into the deal. All right, that's going to be enough for us today. Again, this is Brian Gass. I'm the designated broker for One Realty. For any questions you might have or for more information on the new brokerage services agreements or anything else related to real estate agency in Washington, go to WashingtonAgencyLaw.com. Reach out to us at One Realty at any one of our phone numbers here or any of our social media. Until next time, remember there are many asset classes that you can put your money in, but only one of them that you will call home.